One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
For joining us on One Small Step, I'm your host Jason Rennie, and talking to us today is John C. Wright about being a Christian and being a creative. Thanks for joining us today, John.
You are quite welcome, and I'm qualified on at least one of those two qualifications that you just mentioned.
Excellent. So, for people that don't know you, do you want to give us a little bit of background about who John C. Wright is?
Yes, I am a retired lawyer, retired newspaperman, retired newspaper editor who has written about 20 science fiction and fantasy novels, numerous short stories, and at least 4 or 5 nonfiction works.
Okay. So, you've been at this a while.
Yes.
All right. And I've been honored to be your publisher in the past, when I used to do that sort of thing. Anyway, so you're here to talk. You're a Christian. You've been a Christian for a while. And how does that sort of thing work its way into your writing? I mean, does it impact at all, or yeah? Well,
as an editor, I have to say that you should choose the word effect rather than impact, because only a tooth can be impacted.
Okay.
The question of whether my writing has been influenced by my religion. Now, first, I am a lot less persnickety about words ever since becoming a Christian, because now I'm very forgiving and don't pick on people who. No, I'm kidding. I'm actually worse. So here's the. Let me give you the long, boring answer. When I was first getting started as a science fiction writer, I was an atheist, and I continued in that firm faith and belief in no faith and belief in non-belief for about I'd been that way my entire adult life. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought it was my mission as a science fiction writer, since I was competing with my customers for their beer money, to be like a clown that comes by your house and entertains your kid for a birthday party or something. I was supposed to hit myself in the face with a pie, and since it was science fiction, I was supposed to mention 1 or 2 things about scientific fact to entertain and educate you. But basically, I was supposed to tell amazing stories about space princesses and spaceships and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought it was not my mission and not my job to tell you my political opinions, to tell you my religious opinions, to tell you my philosophical opinions. Now, here's the thing. Anyone who writes anything, if they write from the heart, you're going to get on the page whatever's in your heart. If you write sincerely, if you write honestly, if you're not a hack. So I knew that my opinions would come across no matter what. So consequently, this stern vow I had made to be as neutral as possible and just be an entertainer failed as of my first published book, The Golden Age, which was so libertarian and so Ayn Rand up your nose that it could not possibly be mistaken for anything else. However, I did not win the Prometheus Award, which is a political award given out for science fiction books that are written to forward libertarian ideals. And so I gave up on writing libertarian science fiction and decided to write other stuff instead. Because I had written an almost perfect idea of what a libertarian commonwealth would be like under the best possible conditions. And because I'm a science fiction writer, I also showed how it would fail and how it would have shortcomings based on the limitations of human nature. Okay. So I was in the middle of a fantasy trilogy called Orphans of Chaos when the conversion happened, when God himself struck me over the head with a 2x4 and told me to wake up. This is the way you're supposed to talk to anyone who's as stubborn as a mule. And
I can relate.
At first, I did not think it was my mission to preach my Christianity anymore. I thought it was my mission in the old days to preach my atheism. Mm-hmm. Okay, the people are not hiring me to be a preacher; they're hiring me to write entertainment.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it kind of didn't work, and that was for 2 reasons. The first reason was that the audience became aware that I had converted. I mentioned it once to some guy working for a school newspaper, and the internet was immediately aflame with it, at least the science fiction part of it. Immediately denouncing me and immediately saying that I was irrational and illogical, because we all know people like Thomas Aquinas are not as logical and rational as people like Fred Nietzsche, for example.
Yes.
So in that book, I was deliberately trying to make it so that if Christianity came up, my fairies and warlocks and witches would treat it the way it was treated in every other fairy tale or folk tale, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. I didn't believe in Christianity, but then again, I didn't believe in the Greek gods either, and I had the Greek gods on stage as characters. Mm-hmm. So I had to decide, well, how did they fit into to the Norse gods and to the Christian gods? Now, as an atheist, I had the same respect, which is to say the same disrespect, for all the gods, which means that if I was going to treat them as characters in my story, I was going to treat them legitimately the way they were portrayed in the myths. Okay. Zeus is a somewhat impressive and admirable character, but he's also an adulterer, and Venus is also a harlot. So, when it came time to portray Christ, I only had like a passing mention of him, but I thought I had to say something because it was too obvious if I just didn't mention. All the other gods are on stage and are supernatural beings that are doing stuff, but not him. So yeah, I had to mention something about it. So I wrote a scene where I said that God was just another creature like Zeus, but he was. And by the way, in my story, these were like extra dimensional alien beings. They weren't actually supernatural. They weren't actually divine, but they had magic powers. If that makes sense. Sort of like the way Thor is treated in the Marvel movies. He's not really a god, but he was worshipped as a god.
Yes.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So I thought if Christ was not really a god, but was worshipped as a god, then what kind of guy was he? And I said, well, he was a desert hermit who was jealous of the other gods and didn't really get along with them, and that's why he preached love and peace. So that didn't make sense. Even as an atheist, I didn't want to put that across. That didn't seem to work. So what I finally did is I said, okay, one of my characters is a immortal from the 5th century A.D., and that she is a Christian. She's actually she's one of these immortal beings. She was worshipped as a goddess in her time. And she doesn't know what the Christians are. She doesn't know what Christ is. She thinks that he's one of them, but she's not sure. And I thought I would just leave it as a mystery. And to amuse myself, because I was an atheist, I said she was a Donatist and was convinced that her small heresy was actually the one true universal Christian church, and everyone else was wrong, you say, because I thought, to kind of tweak the nose to the people who think their denomination is right and all the other denominations are wrong. But I also had it so that, like, when my young warlock was trying to cast a spell, if he was within sound of church bells, his spell would fail, because that's the way magic is treated in folktales. Okay? Church bells drive back thunderstorms because if they're summoned up by witches, for example. That's no more me preaching Christianity than to say that the Book of the Dead will drive back a mummy. If you take my meaning, it's just something I took from the lore.
Yeah.
Well, when the at least 2 critics found out that I had converted, they dismissed my book which I wrote when I was an atheist, as Christian apologetics on par with C.S. Lewis. Yeah. Now, aside from the compliment of being compared to C.S. Lewis, who is an exquisite writer, and he would be an exquisite science fiction writer if people only remembered that he had written science fiction. I thought that, well, if they're going to mock me for being a Christian for my atheist books, maybe I should not bother to hide it or anything. And I certainly don't want to, hide it. I don't want to hide my Christianity from men if I want Christ to say that I'm Christian when it comes time for me to be presented to his Father. A trial I'm not looking forward to, just by the way. So then other things happened. It snowballed. A certain kerfluffle happened in the Hugo Awards when the Hugos were taken over by a small cabal backed by my publisher, Tor Books, to try to only award the Hugo Award, which is the science fiction version of the Oscars, to Tor authors who were politically correct. And there was a certain small group of people, led by Larry Correia, who objected to this and said, well, maybe we should judge the science fiction on the basis of its science fiction writing quality, of whether it's a good story or not based on the skin color of the, maybe we should judge based on the content of the character of the book, not based on the skin color of the author, but the forces of evil were dead set against judging books by their merit. And so the one openly Christian story that I had written, it was not even a science fiction story, it was a fantasy story similar to It's a Wonderful Life or something like that, where a mother who has a daughter who is dying of a disease. Her husband is away at the wars, and the little girl wants to stay awake long enough to meet Santa Claus when he comes down the chimney at Christmas time. And the mother promises that she'll be allowed to stay awake, and of course the girl does not stay awake, and in fact passes away. And so the mom has a dead body in her arms on Christmas Eve while her husband is gone. And it was a very difficult story for me to write. I am not usually given to any attempt to convey deep emotion. And in the fantasy, what happens is the real Saint Nicholas of Asia, shows up. The Archbishop of Turkey shows up, and the real Saint Nicholas is quite a man. He's the guy who punched out the heretic Arian at the Council of Ephesus and got reprimanded. And he also found some dead children in a pickle barrel and resurrected them to life. And the murderer was so stricken with guilt and fear that he converted on the spot and saved his soul from eternal damnation. So Saint Nick is, and he's also the patron saint of sailors, just by the way, which, you know, my dad was a Navy guy, so I kind of always liked him. This story did not win, even though it was going to win, because my fans that year had been very motivated to, you know, to come after me in droves and vote. I was very pleased. In fact, I've got my own tiny little corner of history is that I got nominated for more awards in 1 year than any other author. I was nominated for 7 awards in 1 year. But instead, the cabal decided that they would bring in ringers and pay for votes to have me voted under no award. And this was while, by the way, not that I'm bitter, they were claiming that I was doing this, that I, with my money, was buying people's votes. I was buying $50 a shot memberships in Worldcon just to pack the voting. Yeah, come on.
Yeah.
So I went out the back to get money from the money tree, but it was we had a bad season that year or something.
Yes.
In any case, be that as it may. So the worldly reward of the Hugo Award and the other praise from my peers was beginning to mean a lot less to me in terms of what my role was, what my job, or if I may say so, what my vocation was. Because then I got a tear-stained letter from a reader who liked the story, and she said that she had had a child pass away, and the story actually meant something to her, and it helped her get through some of her grief. And I had certainly not thought it would have so profound an impact on anyone. I just meant it as a bit of fantasy. And I realized that woman was far more important to me than a group of venal and vicious, backbiting Worldcon members and their worldly opinions. So then I thought, well, if I'm going, I might as well be hanged for a sheep as for a lamb. If people are going to denounce me as a Christian for writing atheist books, and then go out of their way to spend money to deny me votes because they hate my religion so much they won't even consider judging me fairly, what am I hiding my religion for? What am I going out of my way to try to just be an entertainer for? So, and then I realized something else. I realized that Christianity was going to creep into my books whether I wanted it to be there or not, for the same reason that my philosophy tends to creep into my books whether I want it to or not. I sit down to try to write just an action thriller, and I end up writing a treatise on economics because it's a subject that I'm interested in. So I then also realized that I didn't just have to answer to my worldly readers for what I was doing with my time and my life, but there was also someone who gave me the talent to do what I do, and who, I mean, I could not write a good story on my own. Even as an atheist, I knew that I was getting inspiration from somewhere. I just didn't know where it was from. So I then decided simply to be natural about it, not to try to force the matter. But I also did not like writing sermons. I didn't want to be preachy about it either, because I've read books that were preachy, and some of those books I actually liked. I liked Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. I think it's a very well-constructed sermon disguised as a book. And I also like some of the bookish parts that are almost like a book. And I liked Starship Troopers by Rob Heinlein. It was one of the best lectures on civic militarism I've ever seen. It also had power armor and, you know, psychic powers and bugs and all that good stuff. But those lectures are only written for people who are already convinced. Those books are only meant for preaching to the choir, or maybe to snaring new readers who are unwary enough not to be able to tell when a book is a book, when it's not a book. And I wanted to write books. I didn't want to write lectures. Now, here's another thing that I have to say about me. I used to work for a newspaper, and the editor gave me space on the editorial page once a week. So I became addicted to opinionating. I'm giving my opinion once a week, and I still do it on my blog at least twice a week. I write a 2,000 words of opinion. So I have other outlets if people actually want to hear what I'm saying. But what my muse says is smarter than what I say. So I recommend that they read my fiction rather than my essays, because I think you're going to get more out of it. Mm-hmm. I finally come around to saying I'm not going to hide it, but I'm not going to force it on anyone either. Because here's my theory, and this would be my advice to anyone who's asking the question for themselves. If God's in your heart, then what you write, if you write from the heart, is going to have him in it. But it's not going to be shoved up the reader's nose the way Ayn Rand or Bob Heinlein felt they had to do what they did, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. It's just going to be natural. It's going to be authentic, and it's going to come from the heart.
Okay. So there's two great Christian, there's lots of great Christian writers, but the two Christian writers everyone's probably familiar with would be...
Why don't we agree that they're the two great ones? Because I think I know who you're going to say.
Well, I'm going to say C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien.
Yes, I'm not surprised.
I was going to say John C. Wright and no.
No. Then I would be surprised.
I enjoy your stuff. You're a great writer. But anyway.
Sure, I think I'm enjoyable. I don't think I'm up to the level of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. J.R.R. Tolkien, along with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, has the distinction of establishing his own genre. Okay? High fantasy would not exist if it weren't for him, and all the people who are writing after him in his genre are either copying him or deliberately rebelling against him. Okay?
Fair enough.
Now, don't get me wrong, we'd still have sword and sorcery fantasy, we'd still have Conan-style stories, but those people are either copying or rebelling against Robert E. Howard. Okay.
Fair enough. But okay. So we've got J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and Tolkien, obviously known for The Lord of the Rings, was a Catholic. Yeah. And his Catholicism in his writings, it's there, and it's all through it, but it's relatively subtle. Then you have something like C.S. Lewis and his Narnia books, which much less subtle, like everybody knows Aslan is Jesus. That's not a spoiler or anything, like that's sort of, people know, there's a much more direct allegory there in a way you don't get in Tolkien. And then of course you have
Aslan says so at the end of Voyage of the Dawn Treader. He says, I was in your world and I looked like a lamb at that time.
Well, so there we go.
It's pretty clear.
But then we have something like Lewis's writings, The Great Divorce or the Screwtape Letters, which they're very... The Great Divorce is a story about a guy that comes from hell and visits the outskirts of heaven, and it's basically a parable about the Christian life, I suppose, or,
I would say it was a parable rather than a story, because I would say that The Great Divorce was more akin to Thomas More's Utopia, which was a treatise disguised as a traveler's tale. But of course, modern traveler's tales are set either in outer space or other dimensions or something. And so The Great Divorce is actually even presented as a dream, similar to the way Pilgrim's Progress starts, which also is presented to the reader as if it's a dream.
John Bunyan and Pilgrim's Progress would be similar to, The Great Divorce, The Pilgrim's Regress by Lewis, or The Screwtape Letters. These are very... I think we talked about it one time and you said, and I thought you were right, you've got The Lord of the Rings. Anybody can enjoy that, but it's a work by a Christian. You've got the Narnia books.
But I would add.
Well, why don't you explain? Why do I
Catholic reads Lord of the Rings? He's going to get a layer of depth and a layer of meaning to it that other readers are not going to get. So he may enjoy it more, but I don't think the average reader who's not Catholic or not Christian is going to lose anything except for some of the deep things that they're not going to be able to see anyway. For example, the figures of Frodo, Aragorn, and Gandalf correspond to the three figures of prophet, priest, and king. priest being the guy who makes the sacrifice. In this case, Frodo sacrifices his basically his life because he has to leave Middle Earth. Mm-hmm. Spoiler warning. Frodo leaves at the end.
The movies are 20 years old. The books are even older. If you haven't read them by now,
nonetheless, if there's someone who hasn't read it out here who hears this podcast, I'd like him to try it.
Fair enough.
It has a surprise ending. Frodo does not succeed at his quest. He gets some help from an unexpected source. But you're correct that Tolkien did not shove anything up the reader's nose. That the religion informs the behavior and the portrayal of even things like inanimate objects like mountains or living things like forests and so on have a personality to them, which is deeply Christian and deeply Catholic in its approach. The lembas wafers of the elves that fill up the spirit without necessarily feeding the body. To Catholics would have a very deep meaning, which other people might not get. Mm. But anyone can read the story. Anyone can read the adventure story that is surrounding it, because everyone understands what a quest is, even though he, ironically, was having a quest not to gain a treasure like the Jason and the Argonauts, but to get rid of a treasure. Now, I would say that Pilgrim's Progress or the Pilgrim's Regress by Lewis is a different sort of book altogether, because in an allegory, every character has one and only one function in the story, and the story is not actually about the story. The story is not about the character development or growth or change of Pilgrim or his friend's vanity and foolishness or what have you. They're just there to represent the Christian life and the foolish life and the vain life. There's nothing else to them. There's not supposed to be anything else to them. It's just a long, elaborate metaphor. The parables of Christ, however, are something slightly different. So while parables have a certain symbolic meaning, they also have several possible symbolic meanings, each one this sort of deeper than the next. The parable of the prodigal son, for example, might just be talking about people who fall away from their religion and then come back again, whereas the person who had been faithful his whole life is annoyed that he's not celebrated as much. But it also might have a lot of other meanings too, either more specific or more general. It has so much application, it actually sounds like it's the kind of thing a God would say if he was to speak to us. And I'm very pleased that he decided to speak mostly in stories and parables, because I think a story actually tells you more about what you want to hear than a mere news report would do, than a mere philosophical treatise would do. So that's why I think something like C.S. Lewis's work has more impact than even the best sermons penned by the best sermonizers in every pulpit in the world. Because for one thing, he's speaking to a general audience of everyone who likes fantasy stories. Everyone likes fairy tales, which should be a lot more people than it is, but it's a lot of people. But he is pretty clearly Christian. If you don't get the Christian overtones, you're kind of missing some of the point. I still think you can enjoy the books. I think you can enjoy the first book even if you're not a Christian, even if you don't understand anything of what the symbolism is. I think the second book less so, because the central moral quandary there is whether to take someone on faith or not. If you remember what the second book is about, Prince Caspian. Mm-hmm. But I have forgotten what the question was that started this conversation, so I'm ashamed to admit.
No, that's okay.
So you heard my opinions of Lewis until... Oh, no, I was going to say one other opinion before you actually tell me what I'm supposed to be saying.
Okay, go
what
ahead.
The question's supposed to be. His space trilogy, Lewis's space trilogy...
One of my favorites. I love it.
I think you have to be a Christian to understand at least the second book, because angels and archangels come on stage as characters, and the book ends with a vision of man's place in the universe that is a profoundly Christian vision. It's not going to fit into your H.G. Wells socialist bugs on the moon kind of story. I believe that, by the way, the reason why I went out of my way to mention H.G. Wells is because if you want to compare and contrast the way a Christian science fiction writer writes Christian science fiction and the way a socialist does it, is H.G. Wells writes Men on the Moon, First Men on the Moon. Mm-hmm. And they find a utopia, a socialist utopia, and it is inhuman and bug-like, so much so that the creatures there are merely used and disposed of as units, and it's horrible. And the main character dies horribly. The secondary character, the businessman, returns to Earth manages to have a child fall into a spaceship to die horribly, flung into outer space to there slowly starve and die after being deprived of oxygen or whatever. And the whole point of the book is the great lunar makes a speech condemning mankind for our warlike ways. Okay, it's interesting as a science fiction reader. It's very imaginative. Don't get me wrong. It's actually brilliant, but there's also no depth to it. There's also no heart to it. Mm-hmm. Lewis wrote Out from the Silent Planet sort of as a response, sort of as an answer to Wells's First Men on the Moon. And I believe Pure Elendra, his second book, was also written as a response to H.G. Wells' The Time Machine. There's certain odd parallels between the two books. Like they both have flowers in their pockets when they return from their voyage. One guy goes to the far future after mankind has evolved into Morlocks and Eloi, and the other guy goes to a planet where mankind is still in Eden, is still in the beginning. So, one guy arrives and is unhealthy and has a meal, and the other guy arrives and thinks everyone on Earth is unhealthy because he's been exposed to the solar radiation that grants health and life, and so on and so forth. There's certain parallels that I think are not accidental. But the story could still be enjoyed and be read by someone who's not Christian. You're just not going to get as much out of it as a Christian would. And the things that are Christian, if you're allergic to Christianity, and a lot of people are these days, they're gonna rub you the wrong way. They're gonna set you off. On the third hand, his book, That Heat Is Strength, could be read separately, by the way, even though it's in the trilogy. And that's his essay, Abolition of Man, set as a fictional work. But unlike Heinlein and Ayn Rand, whom I've criticized, his essay is merely a matter of a demonstrative example of what it would look like if a small group of wicked socialists, including wicked priests and cowardly bureaucrats and limp-wristed aristocrats, try to take over England under the name of science, and of course they kill off the only real scientist who's on stage, a man named Hengist. They murder him on the highway. Spoilers. And they're trying to build the Tower of Babel, and they suffered the same defeat of confusion as the original architects of worldly pride did back in the day. It's a brilliant book, but if you want to turn an essay into a book, read that book and look at what he did, because he did not stop as Heinlein did and have a character go into a classroom for a lecture and then have a lecturer's speech repeated word for word on the page. Nor did he stop and have John Galt interrupt all the radio stations of the world with his super high-tech magic and then give an hour-long speech about his philosophy, giving his metaphysics and his premises and his epistemology and his ethics and his politics. Okay, if you're going to show an example, then pick a good example that shows what you want, but make it a realistic example, for the same reason that if you draw a real picture, that even if you don't know what all the shapes mean in the landscape you're drawing, if you portray it faithfully, a person who's familiar with that landscape is going to recognize things in it that you didn't know what you were writing. You just wrote down what you saw, see? You just painted what you saw. But if you have painted it faithfully, there's going to be resemblances there. There's going to be echoes. There's going to be symbolic meanings to it that you might not even be aware of. That is why I'm convinced the muse is often smarter than the writer.
That's fair. So we have these different examples of storytelling, and we have something like the Screwtape Letters or the Great Divorce, which isn't very subtle. I mean, do you think a non-Christian could enjoy those? I'm guessing probably not.
Sure, because a non-Christian could enjoy listening to how temptation works, even if he doesn't believe literally in the mechanism of devils trying to tempt people. He has a human heart. He can see what goes on there.
Yeah, fair enough.
I don't think he's going to get as much out of it, though. I don't think it's possible.
No, that's fair. So, when it comes to storytelling, do you think it's a good way of sneaking truth into people?
I will refer you to what I just said about parables. I think it is the only way to sneak truth into people, because I think we humans are divided beings. We're half animal and half angel. We're half creatures of pure reason, like a Vulcan or a Huinum from Johnny Swift, and we're half creatures of pure sentiment and emotion, like the Morlocks or the Eloi or the Yahoos, again, from Swift. And in our hearts, the good Lord has planted a little nagging voice of conscience that all our worldly philosophies try to smother. Okay, this is why I'm not, as a philosopher and a professional philosopher, I've actually been paid for my philosophizing. As a professional philosopher, I think that all modern philosophy is just rubbish, because sometime about the time of Descartes, people started to try to exclude God from their philosophy. So instead of men like Thomas Aquinas, who are brilliant, remorselessly logical as any Vulcan, and also have profound insights into human nature and human character that can actually help you change your life, modern philosophers are either advocates of pure evil, like good old Fred Nietzsche, or they're total disgusting hypocrites, like good old Rousseau, or they're people who are piffling about nonsense, like Wittgenstein, and basically they all saw off the branch they're sitting on. They use words to say words are meaningless. They use logic to prove logic doesn't mean anything. They announce the only truth is that there is no truth. They say it is unethical to believe in ethics, and so on and so on and so on. Because without God, the human mind turns against itself. So we're divided into two sections. We're divided into the reasonable section and the passionate section, the emotional section, the appetites. And let's say that's three sections, because some of our passions are directed toward noble objects, like patriotism is a passion. You're not born with it. Hunger for food, you're born with. The sexual appetite, you're born with. Once you have a certain philosophy in place, and you're going to have one whether you want to or not, you're going to pick it up from your environment if you don't stop and think about it yourself. So you're either going to have one by default, by accident, or you're going to have one that you've consented to, that you've thought about, you've pondered, prayed about, and adopted. But a story reaches you through your heart. A story reaches you through your passions and your appetites, through your sense of what is realistic and not realistic, your sense of what is right and wrong. Because everyone, even atheists, knows there's something wrong with this world. The atheists hope that the world in the future will evolve into a utopia. At least they used to believe that. I don't know what they think now. I think nowadays they're just hoping for the comet that comes smash us to pieces. Christians, however, think that the paradise was in the past, in Eden, as it is, and the ancient Greeks had a golden age too, and many other religions as well. The question of how to get there, of how to achieve, of how to cure what is wrong with the world, of how to cure the world's pain, is something we all kind of ponder about, and we all have a certain idea as to what would be best to do with it. But a story is going to show you an example of that. It's going to show you a world that's slightly better than this world, if you know what I'm saying. I'm not going to say all. I don't say all stories about Eden. I say all stories are about heroes who are smarter or stronger than we are. Now, I shouldn't say all stories. I should say larger than life stories. Science fiction tends to be a heroic or epic type of story. But you can also have stories that are film noir. Detective stories or thrillers tend to have your characters acting less moral than they ought to be, unless they're good film noir, in which case the detective is better than the rest of them, and the criminals are worse than your reader, if you know what I'm saying. I'm answering a very simple question in a very roundabout way, and I apologize for that.
That's okay.
When you're reading a story, your mind, your soul is going to react to the glory and the goodness you see in there, which you're not seeing in life. Because in real life, some crimes are not solved, but in a detective story, they're supposed to be solved. In real life, not all love stories end in true love, but if you're reading a romance novel, if you're reading Pride and Prejudice, not only is the young lady going to end up with the guy, but she's going to end up with a guy who's richer than she is, and she's going to actually spit in the eye of the Duchess who tries to stand in her way. The lovers are going to overcome all the obstacles. If you're going to read a pirate story, if you're going to read Treasure Island, in a story, you end up with the treasure. The good guys win, and the pirates lose. Israel Hand gets shot in the face. But not in real life. See, that's why we read stories. We want to see things that are happening in real life that are not the way they're doing in real life. Now, keep in mind, we also read horror stories because there we want to explore the fears that we really wish would not come across us in real life. Okay. Even stories about supernatural fears like vampires and werewolves and whatnot are samples or examples or things that emotionally feel the same as some of these things that we make. We may not have ever met an honest-to-goodness blood-sucking vampire in our lives, but we've all met people who mooch off other people. We've all met people who act like vampires, including some guys who are really smooth about it, like the Count is. So, be that as it may, if you're going to try to tell someone about Christianity, the best way to do it is to present our view of the world as a story, because our story is a better story because it's more realistic, and because it's more cynical. We think all men are sinners. We don't think anyone doesn't have feet of clay, except for one guy, and he got crucified. And B, we think there's going to be a happy ending. So ultimately, but not now. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Other stories either are too simple, the good guys just win, and where's the cost of that? No one has to leave Middle Earth and go off to the West because they've suffered too much in most stories. At the end of the first Star Wars movie, the three guys got medals. There was no dead bodies in caskets on the stage. You say there was no Boromir there who had made a sacrifice. More to the point, there was no Boromir who had given into the temptation and failed the quest. In fact, Star Wars was so charming because the lovable rogue who you thought was going to just take his money and leave comes back at the last minute and saves the hero, who gets a lucky shot and is guided by spiritual forces to, blow up the big ogre's castle in which the Dark Knight lives. Excuse me, to blow up the space station in which the evil psychic knight is living. So these stories speak to not just your mind, but to your whole person, to your heart and soul. See? If you want to convince someone intellectually of Christianity, the most you can hope to do is point out the errors and the mistakes that intellectuals raised to Christianity. Does that make sense? You can shoot down fallacious objections. That's all you're going to do in a man's mind. That's not the Holy Spirit. That's not going to lead them to the Christian worldview. What's going to lead them to the Christian worldview is they're going to look at the story that Marxists tell, or that critical race theory tells, or that radical feminism tells, or that race hustlers tell. Their story is a story of worldly oppression and a scapegoat. And they say if you kill the scapegoat, the worldly oppression will cease, and suddenly utopia will appear for no reason, and everyone will live happily ever after. And that is a stupid story. Most children's fairy tales have much more depth than that does. Okay? Even a story like Cinderella, and Marxism is a Cinderella tale that says your fairy godmother will make the laws of economics just somehow go away if you just kill the rich people. It's a simple story, and there's no redemption in it, there's no love in it, and there's no brotherhood in it. In the communist story, you can't have a bad guy turn into a good guy like Han Solo. Okay? You can't have a guy have committed a sin and then redeem himself, because if he's a cis white hetero patriarchal male, he can't suddenly become a member of the oppressed class or what have you. So the Christian story is much finer than this story. It is a story of hope. It's a story of faith. It's a story of love. Everyone loves love stories. Even people who don't like love stories like love stories. And if I may just tell another personal anecdote, way back when I started my career, when I was still an atheist, and I was resolved not to tell anyone my opinions about things and just to entertain, my first book that came out had a divorced husband in it who, over the course of the story, re-seduced his wife and won her love again. And they got married, or at least he married a clone of her because they had cloning or what have you. Okay. My first review from anyone was from a radical feminist who objected ferociously to the idea that I would portray true love as being a real thing. And I said, well, good golly, Miss Molly, if they're going to object to marriage, if marriage is the thing that makes them crazy, I might as well say all my opinions, because I'm not going to be able to please these people with anything I write, because I'm a romantic. I believe in heroism. I believe in true love. I believe that women should be women and men should be men, and men should be manly men at that, and women should be feminine women. See? So, as I said, might as well be hung for a ram as for a ewe. I'm not going to hide my Christianity from anyone. In fact, I went way out of my way to make my main character in my book, Somewhither, as Catholic as he could be. and because his father is a secret agent working for the Vatican that's going and destroying extra-dimensional demons that sneak into our planet. And he has a magic power that he doesn't know he has, which when he prays, it activates. Now, I don't say that the saints are helping him. It may just be that the substance that got into his bloodstream by mistake is psychoreactive, so that his faith is actually changing making a chemical reaction that has a psychological and psychic side effect. I don't care whether the reader never finds out because the main character never finds out exactly how it works. Mm-hmm. Okay, but the guy prays to Saint Michael before he goes into combat. Okay, so why not? Because he's
yeah.
I decided to write a book that took place in the metaphysical background of the Catholic Church, where the saints are actually real, not just someone's opinion. Now, you can write a book like Dune, which also has a Messiah in it, but he in the book is a false Messiah. Paul Muad'Dib is the Kwisatz Haderach is produced by genetic breeding, by eugenics, and the missionary protectiva of the Bene Gesserit witches, note the word witches, have fooled people into expecting a fake Messiah, but they're going to think he's real. And when Paul is born, he accidentally sets in motion events that he can't control. He cannot stop the jihad that is going to appear because of his birth. Mm-hmm. Now, that story takes place in a different metaphysical background than mine, as does That Hideous Strength, yep. As does Lord of the Rings. See, but the stories are still good no matter what your background is, and there's no reason why the Christian background should be off limits. The Conan stories take place in a metaphysical background of a Lovecraftian horror story, even though those stories are not horror themselves. But all the monsters he meets, all the supernatural demons, are Lovecraftian, are the great old ones that Lovecraft made up. The two were friends. They swapped ideas. Nothing wrong with those stories. If you're a believer in the noble savage theory of Rousseau and you want to kick back and take a vacation from civilization and glorify barbarism, then read a Conan story. They're great. It's been 85 years since they've been published. They're still fine stories. I don't approve of what they preach, but then again, you don't have to accept what they preach when you read the story if you're just reading it for your pleasure. I can read Thor comic books without being a Norse worshiper. Yeah. You say. And because if I was a Norse worshiper, I might be a little offended that Thor gets his ass kicked by Mr. Hyde or by the Serpent Man or by the Absorbing Man, some of the other lame villains that he occasionally is put up against. Be that as it may. The reason why we need stories to tell these truths is because a story is the only way we have to speak to the whole person, to speak to his heart and soul. I don't think that just writing a story intellectually that's just approaching his mind is a good approach. I think that people who try that approach end up writing lectures, and that's what I complained about earlier about Ayn Rand and Bob Heinlein, whose stories I do like, except for Heinlein, of course. Now that I'm grown up, I realize he was lying to me his whole life about monotheism and monogamy, and he was basically lying to children for money. So that's not exactly the best moral character you have there. And Ayn Rand was an adulteress, so yeah. Maybe they should not be tempting the unwary into sin, but hey, they're the ones who have to answer for it, not me.
Fair enough.
It's more fun to tempt people into virtue too, but just by the way, because your virtuous characters have to live up to a higher standard, and it makes it harder for them. And writers love it when they can torment their characters by making things hard for them. It's our pride and joy.
Fair enough. Okay, so to wrap things up, what advice would you give to a Christian writer if they want to write a story that's, I guess, honoring to God without writing? I mean, by comparison, a lot of Christian rock music today is just terrible. A lot of. Let
me ask you why. Is it terrible because it's too obvious, or is it terrible because it's a love story, the love song just has Jesus in there instead of my girl?
Well, but you get Christian movies as well, and they're often not very good. They seem heavy-handed, but also they're just, I don't know, they're missing something. What advice would you give to writers to avoid doing that? To avoid producing this stuff that you're going to be mocked for being a Christian. Well, that's fine. That's the territory. But
Yeah,
Nobody,
that's actually a blessing. When people revile you in Christ's name, then you get blessed.
Well, that's true.
But if they revile you for being a bad artist, you don't get anything.
So how do you
study your art, study your craft.
Well, this
here's what I would say.
Yes, please.
I am not as condemnatory as you are.
Okay.
I think that if a woman wants to see a romantic little story about a Hallmark movie, holiday movie, where the guy and the girl are going to get together at the end, and she's going to give up her life as an ad executive and settle down in a small town in Vermont or something, you know what you're getting. Okay, they're not deep. They're meant to be sentimental. I don't mind that for the same reason I don't mind if a person wants to eat a hamburger rather than filet mignon. Okay, if you want to write Christian Hallmark movies, there's some good ones out there.
Oh yeah,
you're only going to reach You're going to reach only the audience that's in the mood for that, and they're not going to be deep. I don't mind. I mean, I write space opera. I don't. If any depth that comes into my writing is by accident. Okay, but if you want to write something that's going to glorify God, if you want to write something that's going to persuade the unwary to take a second look at Christianity, if you're going to write something that portrays the world as it actually is and not as the filthy materialists have lied to you for years that the way the world is, okay? Their lie is that the world is without hope. Their lie is that existence ends at death. Their lie is that all moral quandaries are social or economic or political in nature. Their lie is that the human being is not made in the image and likeness of God, but is merely an inefficient ape with no hair and an overlarge brain. That's their worldview, okay? Now, in our worldview, if you look at stories in the Bible, you will see that our worldview is not as pleasant as a Hallmark card romance holiday movie, even if you want to write a movie where a guy gets run over by a car and converts to Christianity at the very end, fine, do it. But know your audience, and that's who you're writing for. If you want to write a movie that's going to say that God appointed Saul the king and then he turned against David in madness, even though David killed a giant for him, and you're going to write about David's son committing adultery with his sister, and there being a murder, and there being a guy hung up in a tree when he's trying to get away, when he's trying to betray his own father and leading a revolt, you're going to be writing about real human sorrow and real human pain and human ambition and lust and pride, and you're going to write about King David when he should have been away at the wars, looking out of the window and seeing a girl bathing on the rooftop across the street and saying, "Hey, I think it would be a fine idea to kill one of my best generals so I can get at his girl." That's who you're writing about. You're writing about us. You're writing about the crooked human beings. Now, you can also write about the saints because they're rare, but they exist. Okay, and most of them. Don't get the Catholic Church wrong. We know about some of the saints because God has by miracle revealed it to us. But most saints go unawarded and unapplauded in this life, okay? Little old ladies who go out every day to help the poor that no one even knows their name, okay? Blind guys who pray and their prayers are answered. Christians don't have to be built like Arnold Schwarzenegger to be heroes, okay? Your range of possible heroes you can put in your stories is greater than what the worldly people put in their stories, and your ending doesn't need to be either as happy or as sad as theirs, because they only have one or two possible endings, whereas we have multiple myriad endings. We can, you can either end on a Good Friday and have it be a sad ending, or you can end on Easter Sunday and have it be a happy ending, or you can set your story in good Holy Saturday when you just don't know what's going to happen next. And you're wondering why the guy you thought that was on the side just got killed by the Romans. If you understand my metaphor, as a Christian, you have a wider range of options. You have more of humanity to pick from because we're all the sons of God. Whereas someone who's politically correct can only take from the identified victim group, and the identified villain group has to be one of those villains. If you're writing a story for Stalin, if you're a Russian filmmaker, and you want to make a movie, you have to make Alexander Nevsky. Now, it's a good movie. Alexander Nevsky is a good movie if you've never seen it. It's got a brilliant score by Prokofiev, but all the characters are one-dimensional and meant to be. There is a merchant who gives all his weapons, a blacksmith who gives all his weapons to the army to fend off the Germans. The Germans are portrayed only as villains who throw children onto fires and are just terrible people who have crosses and stuff that they march under, and they're conquerors and they're inhuman, and the Nevsky himself is has no flaws. He's not like King David, who was an adulterer. He's not even like Moses, who was a murderer. Just by the way, that's why Moses ran away into the desert. Just for those of you who forget that little tidbit, okay? If you're writing a story for Stalin, and we now live in a world where Stalin himself is not running it, but political correctness is pretty Stalinistic.
Yeah.
It's the next best thing. And it's voluntary. If you're writing for Stalin, you're going to write a limited story for a limited audience using a limited range of options and a limited number of themes, okay? And if you're really politically correct, you're not going to be able to write any story at all. All you're going to be able to do is take a Star Trek or a Star Wars and ruin it.
Yeah.
Pull down a monument, pull down a statue. But if you're a Christian, you can write about every story that a Christian writes can be a love story, even a story that takes place under horrible circumstances, even a story about a guy in a concentration camp, even a story about a blind woman, even a story about people arguing over a pearl, even a story about a guy going to hell, purgatory, and heaven in a dream. Even a story about a war among angels, even a story about the fall of man, if you're going to write Milton, if you're going to write Dante, if you're going to write anything you like. That Heat of Strength is a story about a man and his wife, and they decided not to have kids, and the guy is a minor intellectual at a college, and the college is being taken over by the progressive element. That's what the story's about. Oh, and there's also, King Arthur and Merlin and gods from outer space and magical bears and other things are also in the tale. But you can make anyone a hero. You have a wide range of themes. You have a greater depth to your understanding of human nature if you look at the Bible and copy ideas from that. Okay, or look at the entire Western canon of literature, starting about AD 100 or so, and see what previous Christian writers have done. Because those guys wrote stories, and they were in a Christian background, breathing and living the Christian assumptions of a Christian worldview. And even the guys who wrote things that were deliberately anti-Christian, like the Ring trilogy of Wagner, was deliberately pagan and was deliberately trying to undo some of the Christian ideals. But he couldn't help but make certain elements. You can't not make mercy seem good unless you're Nietzsche. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
It does.
If you're a Christian writing a love story, and love story is always going to be attractive on some level to someone. So my advice is to just be brave, and if you have to write a story that takes you out of your comfort zone, then trust in your muse if you think your muse comes from heaven. If you think you got a pagan muse, then write a sword and sorcery story and just be content with that.
Fair enough. Well, good advice. Well, thank you very much.
We don't know because no one's taken it yet. We haven't seen anyone try it. So we hope it's good advice.
Well, we hope it's good advice.
Oh, no, I'm going to say one other piece of advice that's only useful for Christians.
Sure.
And I mean this completely honestly. If you're doing something for the glory of God, before you sit down and do it, stop and say a prayer. Stop and pray and listen in your heart to what God has to say, because he might tell you that a certain scene is too lascivious or not lascivious enough, or too violent or not violent enough. You understand what I'm saying? Be guided even in your daily work, whether you're a carpenter or a poet, by your guardian angel. The guardian angel's there to guard you. Listen to him. I should have said that first.
Fair enough. No. All right. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to join us today, John. If people want to find more of your works, where's a good place to look?
If you look on my website, which is sci-fi-write.com, I have a list of works where there are live links, which I hope I've kept up to date, to all my novels and my nonfiction and my anthologies. I think that's the best. Or you can just type my name into Amazon. You'll find most of my stuff. You can also go to the Silver Empire homepage. And I believe Castalia House is still selling one or two of my books.
Okay.
So.